Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the New Mexico Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the rugged terrain of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where civilization barely clung to the edges of wilderness in 1868, there existed a man whose name would eventually be spoken in whispers across the New Mexico Territory. This is the documented account of Ezekiel Thorne, known to weary travelers as the hospitable mountain man who offered shelter, food, and water to those crossing the treacherous mountain passes between Santa Fe and Taos. What few realized until it was too late was that Thorne's hospitality came with a price that no decent person would willingly pay. The New Mexico Territory, in 1868, was a place of striking contrasts and uncertain boundaries. Just 20 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had transferred the region from Mexico to the United States, it remained a frontier in every sense of the word. The Civil War had ended just 3 years prior, leaving the territory in a state of administrative limbo as federal attention focused on Reconstruction in the South. Law enforcement was scattered and often ineffective, particularly in the remote mountain regions where settlements were isolated by both geography and the harsh elements. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains, whose name translates to Blood of Christ, stretch from southern Colorado into northern New Mexico, their peaks reaching over 13,000 feet in places. In 1868, these mountains represented one of the most challenging obstacles for travelers in the region. The main route between Santa Fe and Taos, two of the territory's most established settlements, required crossing these mountains typically via the Old Spanish Trail or similar passes that had been used for centuries by indigenous peoples and later by Spanish colonizers. Travel through the mountains was hazardous year-round. Summer brought sudden thunderstorms that could transform dry arroyos into raging torrents within minutes. Autumn and spring were marked by unpredictable weather swings that might trap the unwary in unseasonable snow. And winter in the Sangre de Cristos, was a force that commanded respect even from the most experienced frontiersmen. Temperatures could plummet to fatal levels, and snowdrifts might render trails completely impassable for weeks at a time. It was in this environment, beautiful but unforgiving, filled with opportunity but fraught with peril, that Ezekiel Thorne established his solitary domain. And it was into this domain that a merchant caravan wandered in April of 1868, setting in motion a chain of discoveries that would unveil one of the territory's most disturbing chapters. Our story begins properly on April 17, 1868, when a merchant caravan arrived at a trading post in Taos with 3 fewer members than when they had departed Santa Fe just 5 days earlier. The remaining travelers appeared haggard beyond what even the difficult journey would explain, their eyes hollow, their voices reduced to whispers. When questioned by local authorities about their missing companions, they claimed ignorance, stating only that the terrain was dangerous and separations were common. However, one member of the party, a man named Thomas Wilcox, was observed writing frantically in his journal late into the night at the local saloon. Wilcox was not a merchant himself, but rather a correspondent for the St. Louis Dispatch, sent west to document the development of the territories for readers back east. Described by the saloon keeper as a scholarly type, ill-suited for frontier hardships, but possessed of keen observation, Wilcox had apparently joined the merchant caravan in Santa Fe as a means of safely traversing the region while gathering material for his articles. The account that follows has been pieced together primarily from Wilcox's journal, which was discovered among his possessions after his death in 1869, as well as territorial records, newspaper clippings from the Santa Fe Gazette, and testimonies collected during the subsequent investigation in the autumn of that year. What emerges is a portrait of calculated malevolence hidden behind a mask of frontier hospitality, a predator who understood how to exploit the necessary trust that travelers in such regions must place in one another. The Wilcox Journal begins its relevant entries on April 3, 1868, describing his departure from Santa Fe with a group of 6 other travelers. The party included Edmund and Walter Caldwell, brothers who traded primarily in wool and hides, Jonathan Hollister, a surveyor working under contract with the territorial government, Martin Fletcher, a young man described as the Caldwell's assistant, and 2 hired men identified only as Williams and Reynolds, who were responsible for managing the pack animals. Their intention was to reach Taos within 4 to 5 days, a journey that, while demanding, was not uncommon for the time. The first day passed uneventfully, with the party making good progress along the well-established trail. They camped that night in a small valley that Wilcox described as pleasantly situated, with a clear stream providing water for both men and animals. The weather had been favorable, with clear skies and temperatures mild for April. The second day began with similar promise, but as the party navigated the higher elevations by mid-afternoon, Wilcox noted a change in the atmosphere. "There is a stillness in the air that Hollister finds concerning," he wrote. "The birds have ceased their calls, and even the wind seems to have withdrawn its presence. The Caldwells insist we press on, claiming we can reach the summit pass before evening, but I observe Williams checking the sky with increasing frequency." By 4 o'clock, the stillness had given way to what Wilcox described as a wall of gray advancing from the north, consuming the mountain peaks one by one like some ravenous entity. An unseasonable storm descended upon them with remarkable speed and ferocity. Visibility reduced to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted. The trail, already narrow and precarious, became treacherously slick with rapidly accumulating snow. "Edmund Caldwell's certainty has evaporated," Wilcox recorded. "He now speaks of finding shelter, any shelter, before nightfall renders our situation truly desperate." Williams suggests backtracking to a rock outcropping we passed some miles back, which might offer minimal protection from the wind, if not the cold. It is at this moment of collective indecision that Fletcher, who had ranged slightly ahead despite the conditions, returns to our huddled conference with news that changes our course entirely. Fletcher reported seeing a light in the distance, faint but distinct, swaying gently through the snow-laden air. Hollister expressed immediate skepticism, noting that no cabins or settlements should exist in that particular area according to his maps. "There's nothing marked within 5 miles of this position," he allegedly stated, "and that light appears to be due east, away from the main trail." But as the storm intensified and daylight waned, the promise of shelter overrode caution. "We followed the light like moths," Wilcox wrote, grateful for any refuge from the punishing cold. The path Fletcher led us along was narrow and treacherous, forcing us to proceed in single file, each man keeping sight of the one before him, lest we become separated in the whiteout. I recall Martin commenting that we were moving away from the main trail, but desperation has a way of silencing caution. The lantern, for that is what it proved to be, guided them to a substantial log cabin nestled in a clearing sheltered by towering pines. The structure appeared sturdy and well-maintained, with no obvious signs of disrepair despite its isolated location. Smoke curled invitingly from a stone chimney, promising warmth within. Standing in the doorway, lantern held aloft, was the man they would come to know as Ezekiel Thorne. Wilcox's description of their host is worth quoting in full, as it provides the first impression of the figure at the center of this account. He was a mountain of a man, with a beard like tangled wire that obscured much of his face, and eyes that appeared almost colorless in the lantern light, not blue or gray, but something less definable, like water running over stones. His clothing was of good quality, but showed the wear of frontier life, buckskin and wool, practical rather than decorative. He might have been 40 or 60. The elements age a man unpredictably in such places. What struck me most, however, was not his appearance but his manner. For a man living in such isolation, he showed neither surprise nor wariness at our sudden arrival. Indeed, He greeted us with the practiced hospitality of someone who regularly receives guests, ushering us inside with broad gestures and assurances of welcome. Thorne welcomed them effusively, helping them stable their animals in a lean-to attached to the cabin's western wall, then ushering them inside to warm themselves by a fire that had clearly been burning for hours. The cabin's interior was unexpectedly comfortable. Wilcox noted well-crafted furniture, ample furs for bedding, an array of preserved foods hanging from the rafters, and various tools of mountain living arranged with methodical precision. A stew simmered in a large iron pot suspended over the hearth, filling the single-room structure with a rich aroma that Wilcox described as intensely appealing to men who had resigned themselves to cold rations for the night. Once they had shed their snow-crusted outer garments and arranged themselves around the fire, Thorne formally introduced himself, explaining that he had been a trapper and hunter in the region for over 15 years. He claimed to have come west from Pennsylvania in 1853, seeking fortune in furs and the solitude that civilization increasingly denied. He spoke with the ease of someone accustomed to periodic company, referencing recent events in Santa Fe with surprising familiarity for a man living so remotely. When Walter Caldwell remarked on this, Thorne explained that he made the journey to Santa Fe 3 or 4 times yearly to trade furs and purchase supplies. "I time my visits to coincide with the arrival of news sheets from back east," he said, according to Wilcox's account. "A man must keep abreast of the wider world, even if he chooses not to dwell within it." Thorne further explained that he regularly offered shelter to travelers caught in the mountain's unpredictable weather. His cabin was not on any formal map or trail, he admitted, but local guides knew of its existence and occasionally directed parties his way when conditions warranted. "Consider it my Christian duty," he reportedly said, "to provide for those in need. The mountains claim enough souls without adding those who might have been saved by a warm hearth and a full belly." That night, the 7 travelers slept in the main room of the cabin, using their own bedrolls, supplemented by furs that Thorne generously provided. Their host retired to a small adjoining chamber separated from the main room by a sturdy door. Despite his exhaustion, Wilcox recorded that sleep came fitfully. "There was a stillness to the place that seemed unnatural," he wrote, "as though the very air was holding its breath. And beneath that stillness, a sound I couldn't identify, rhythmic, like the beating of a distant drum. At first I attributed it to the settling of logs in the structure, or perhaps the wind finding some crevice to whistle through. Yet it maintained a regularity that suggested purpose rather than chance." It was near dawn when Wilcox was awakened by movement within the cabin. Through half-closed eyes he observed Thorne moving silently among the sleeping travelers, pausing briefly by each person. He appeared to be studying them, Wilcox recorded, like a man might inspect livestock before purchase. There was nothing overtly threatening in his manner. He touched no one, disturbed nothing. Yet something in his methodical progress and intent gaze suggested evaluation rather than concern for his guests' comfort. Thorne lingered longest beside Martin Fletcher, the youngest of their group at perhaps 20 years of age. According to Wilcox, Thorne knelt beside the sleeping young man for several minutes, his expression unreadable in the dim light cast by the banked fire. Eventually he rose and returned to his chamber, closing the door silently behind him. Wilcox did not mention this incident to his companions when they woke. "I had no concrete cause for alarm," he later explained in his journal, and frontier etiquette discourages casting aspersions on those who have offered hospitality. Yet the memory lingered, coloring my perception of our host in ways I could not fully articulate even to myself. The morning revealed that the storm had indeed passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape buried under nearly 2 feet of fresh snow. Sunlight reflected blindingly off the white expanse, and the air held the pristine clarity that often follows mountain storms. Thorne had risen before any of his guests and prepared a substantial breakfast of cornmeal mush, dried berries, and smoked meat that he identified as venison. While they ate, Thorne suggested that the party remain another day to rest their animals and themselves. The The main trail, he explained, would be treacherous until the snow had time to compact or partially melt. No shame in prudence, he told them. According to Wilcox, the mountains reward patience and punish haste with equal measure. Most agreed readily with this assessment, but Wilcox noted that Jonathan Hollister, the surveyor, seemed uneasy with the proposal. "There's something not right about this place," Hollister allegedly whispered to Wilcox while Thorne was occupied outside, checking on the animals. "Did you notice how he watches us? Not with eyes that see people, but with eyes that see something else. And his knowledge of the region's trails is inconsistent. He described a route to Taos yesterday that contradicts the Territorial Office's most recent surveys." Hollister's concerns were dismissed by the Caldwell brothers, who were grateful for the unexpected comfort and saw no reason to rush back into potentially dangerous conditions. Thorne proved to be an engaging host throughout the day, regaling them with tales of his encounters with wildlife, indigenous tribes, and the harsh elements. He prepared more substantial meals than might have been expected from a solitary mountain dweller's stores, explaining that he had recently returned from one of his supply trips to Santa Fe. His curiosity might be nothing more than the natural interest of a man starved for company, Wilcox wrote, yet there is a systematic quality to his inquiries that suggests a purpose beyond mere sociability. That evening, as they again gathered around the fire after the day's surprisingly abundant meal, Thorne produced a jug of liquor that he claimed was genuine Kentucky bourbon, procured at considerable expense from a trader with connections to river commerce. The spirits were potent and readily accepted by most of the party, though Wilcox noted that Hollister abstained and that he himself limited his consumption to a single small cup. Wilcox observed that Thorne seemed particularly interested in their own backgrounds, asking probing questions about their families, their destinations, and whether anyone was expecting them in Taos. As the evening progressed and tongues loosened with alcohol, the conversation turned to the dangers of mountain travel. Thorne recounted various tragedies he had witnessed or heard about over his years in the region, travelers lost to exposure, swept away by flash floods, or fallen from treacherous paths. "The mountains keep their secrets," he remarked, according to Wilcox. "Many who enter never emerge, and of those, many are never found. Nature reclaims its own with remarkable efficiency." The Caldwells contributed tales they had heard from other merchants, stories of entire parties vanishing without trace, of mysterious lights seen in remote places that led travelers astray, of strange sounds echoing through canyons on moonless nights. Williams, who had previously been taciturn, revealed that he had served as a guide for various expeditions before taking his current position with the Caldwells. He spoke of indigenous warnings about certain areas of the mountains, places the native peoples avoided for reasons they would not fully explain to white men. Throughout this exchange, Wilcox observed that Thorne listened with particular intensity, especially to Williams' accounts. There was a hunger in his attention, Wilcox wrote, a leaning forward, a narrowing of those pale eyes, when discussion turned to places where people might vanish, without question, being raised. That second night, Wilcox was awakened from uneasy slumber by what he described as a stifled sound, like a man trying to scream through a thick cloth. He lay motionless, straining to hear in the darkness that was nearly absolute, the fire having burned down to mere embers. The sound did not repeat, but after several minutes of tense listening, Wilcox became aware of soft footsteps crossing the wooden floor, followed by the cabin door opening and closing with deliberate quietness. Unable to master his growing unease, he rose silently and made his way to the small window, its oiled paper covering admitting just enough moonlight to navigate by. Peering out, he could discern two figures moving across the snow-covered clearing toward the tree line. One appeared to be Thorne, distinctive even in silhouette due to his height and broad shoulders. The other was smaller and moved with an odd stumbling gait. The pair disappeared into the darkness of the forest before Wilcox could determine the identity of Thorne's companion. Wilcox debated waking the others, but decided against it, reasoning that he had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, and that Thorne might simply be showing one of the party something nearby. He returned to his bedroll but remained awake until gray light began to filter through the window. Neither Thorne nor the unidentified second person had returned by the time Wilcox finally succumbed to exhaustion. When morning came in earnest, Hollister was nowhere to be found. His bedroll remained, but his personal effects, a leather satchel containing surveying documents, a brass compass, and a small daguerreotype that Wilcox had observed him consulting privately, were gone. Thorne, who emerged from his chamber appearing well-rested despite his nocturnal excursion, seemed unsurprised by the surveyor's absence. Upon being questioned, he suggested that Hollister had decided to continue ahead alone. "Some men can't abide idleness," Thorne offered, by way of explanation. "He came to my room before dawn, said he'd rather make progress than sit around another day. The snow on the main trail should be passable for a single determined traveler." The explanation seemed plausible enough, if somewhat inconsiderate on Hollister's part, and the group accepted it without much question. Only Wilcox, who had witnessed the nocturnal departure but could not be certain it was Hollister with Thorne, harbored significant doubts. "The timing aligns with what I observed," he wrote, "yet something in Thorne's account rings false. Hollister had expressed specific concerns about our host. Would he then seek him out privately? And would he depart without a word to the rest of us, particularly after his expressed misgivings?" That day Thorne invited the remaining travelers to join him in checking his trap lines, explaining that he needed to ensure they hadn't been damaged or buried by the recent snowfall. Martin Fletcher immediately volunteered, apparently eager to observe the practical aspects of mountain living. Edmund Caldwell, the elder of the merchant brothers, also agreed to accompany Thorne, expressing interest in the quality of furs that might be obtained in the region. Walter Caldwell, Williams, Reynolds, and Wilcox elected to remain at the cabin. Thorne provided them with a haunch of smoked meat and instructions for preparing a stew, should the trapline inspection take longer than anticipated. The four men departed after breakfast, Thorne leading the way with a rifle slung across his back and several tools hanging from his belt. Hours passed with no sign of their return. Wilcox used the time to write in his journal and to study a crude map of the territory that Walter Caldwell carried. According to this map, they were indeed some distance from the main trail between Santa Fe and Taos, perhaps 3 or 4 miles east of the established route. No settlements or cabins were marked in this area. As dusk approached, Wilcox describes a growing sense of disquiet among those who waited. "Green paced restlessly by the window," Wilcox wrote, using an apparent error in naming that appears occasionally in his journal. Green is not identified elsewhere, and appears to be Wilcox's mistaken reference to Walter Caldwell. He jumped at every creak and groan of the settling logs, his usual mercantile composure thoroughly disturbed. Williams maintained a stoic facade, but his hand never strayed far from the knife at his belt. "As for myself, I found my attention drawn repeatedly to a particular floorboard near the hearth, one that seemed slightly raised above its fellows, as though it had been recently disturbed." The waiting men discussed their concerns in hushed tones. Walter Caldwell was particularly agitated about his brother's prolonged absence. "Edmund is no outdoorsman," he told Wilcox. "He would not willingly remain in the forest after nightfall. He fears the dark, has since we were boys." Williams shared his own misgivings about their host. "I've guided in these mountains for 8 years," he said according to Wilcox's account, "and never heard tell of a trapper named Thorne, nor of any cabin in this particular valley. The mountain men form a small community. They know each other, if not always by sight, then by reputation and territory. A stranger is noted and discussed. Reynolds suggested they should search for the others if they hadn't returned by full dark, but Williams countered that attempting to follow tracks in failing light would likely result in their own becoming lost. "We wait until morning," he insisted. "If they haven't returned by then, we follow their trail while we can still see it clearly." It was nearly 9 o'clock by Wilcox's estimation when Thorne finally returned with Edmund Caldwell. There was no sign of Martin Fletcher. Walter immediately embraced his brother, who responded with what Wilcox described as mechanical gestures, his gaze fixed and distant. When questioned about Fletcher's absence, Thorne provided an explanation. Martin had twisted his ankle on the trail and was resting at another shelter Thorne maintained further up the mountain, a line cabin he used during the height of trapping season. He would bring him back the following day, he assured them, once the young man's injury had subsided enough for comfortable travel. Edmund Caldwell corroborated the story in a flat, affectless voice, stating that Fletcher's injury had occurred when he stepped into a snow-covered hole while examining one of Thorne's traps. Wilcox noted that the merchant spoke mechanically, his gaze fixed on some middle distance, as though he were reciting words learned by rote rather than recounting events he had witnessed. Throughout the remainder of the evening, Edmund's behavior remained peculiar. He ate little of the stew that had been prepared, responded to his brother's questions with monosyllabic answers, and retired to his bedroll unusually early. Walter attributed this to exhaustion from the day's activities, but Wilcox observed that Edmund did not appear to sleep. He lay with eyes open, Wilcox recorded, blinking at measured intervals, but otherwise motionless, like a man who has retreated deep within himself. That night Wilcox pretended to sleep, but remained vigilant. Shortly after midnight, according to his journal, he observed Thorne emerge from his chamber and approach Edmund Caldwell's seemingly wakeful but unresponsive form. Leaning down, Thorne whispered something in the merchant's ear, words too soft for Wilcox to discern. Without hesitation or question, Edmund rose from his bedroll and followed Thorne outside. Neither returned before Wilcox, overcome by exhaustion despite his determination to maintain watch, finally succumbed to sleep. The morning brought another absence. Edmund Caldwell had vanished, supposedly having decided to check on Martin Fletcher. Thorne, who was already preparing breakfast when the others awoke, explained that Edmund had been concerned about the young man and had left at first light to bring supplies to the line cabin. They should both return by midday, Thorne assured the increasingly uneasy group. The trail is well marked, and Edmund seemed determined. Walter Caldwell's concern had now escalated to genuine alarm. "My brother would never leave without informing me," he insisted. "We have traveled together for 15 years and never separated without clear agreement on when and where to reunite." Thorne's response, as recorded by Wilcox, was solicitous but firm. "Your brother is a grown man who made his own decision," he said. "Perhaps he wished to avoid conflict, knowing you might object to his going alone. In any case, the line cabin is less than 2 hours' walk for someone familiar with the path. I expect they'll return before you've finished digesting breakfast." As the morning advanced with no sign of the missing men, tensions within the cabin increased dramatically. Walter Caldwell became openly accusatory, demanding to know exactly where this line cabin was located and why Thorne had not mentioned its existence earlier. Williams supported these demands, his previously taciturn manner giving way to direct confrontation. Only Reynolds remained somewhat neutral, suggesting there might still be an innocent explanation for the troubling situation. Thorne's reaction was described by Wilcox as a momentary fracturing of his affable mask, something cold and calculating showing through the cracks before he composed himself. The mountain man agreed to lead Walter Caldwell to the supposed shelter to see the missing men for himself. "It seems I've been a poor host if my word is held in such low esteem," he remarked with apparent regret. "I'll take you there myself, and you can see that all is well." Preparations were made for the expedition. Thorne suggested they take supplies, as the weather appeared to be changing again. Clouds were building over the western peaks. Walter insisted they depart immediately, a position Wilcox noted was unusual for the normally cautious merchant. Thorne and Walter Caldwell departed mid-morning, leaving Wilcox, Williams, and Reynolds alone in the cabin. It was then that Wilcox suggested they investigate the raised floorboard that had been drawing his attention since their first night in the cabin. His companions readily agreed, all pretense of respecting their host's privacy having evaporated with the mounting evidence of something amiss. With considerable effort, they pried the floorboard loose, revealing a narrow space beneath. What they found was not the missing men, as they had perhaps feared or hoped, but rather a collection of personal effects: watches, wedding bands, daguerreotypes of families, letters, and various other items that travelers might carry. Most disturbing was a small, leather-bound ledger which contained what appeared to be a meticulous inventory of individuals who had passed through Thorne's cabin over the course of several years. Names were recorded alongside brief descriptions and, most chillingly, assessments of their quality and utility. The most recent entries included J.H., survey maps valuable, himself less so, disposed, and M.F., young, strong, suitable for extended use. We realized then the true nature of our host, Wilcox wrote, and the probable fate of our companions. Whatever Thorne's purpose in separating individuals from the group, it could not be benevolent, and it appeared to follow a pattern established over years rather than arising from some sudden madness. The three men hastily gathered their belongings, intending to flee before Thorne's return. As they prepared to depart, Reynolds discovered a concealed door in the rear of Thorne's private chamber. Despite William's warning that they should focus on escape rather than further investigation, Reynolds insisted on learning what lay behind the hidden entrance. The door led to a crude cellar, dug into the earth beneath the cabin. What they found there, Wilcox declined to describe in detail, noting only that the space spoke of methodical depravity, a butcher's workshop where the butcher took particular pleasure in his task. He did record that among the implements and stains that defied innocent interpretation, they discovered several items belonging to Hollister, including the brass compass he had carried. They had just emerged from this grim discovery when the cabin door opened. Thorne stood framed in the doorway, alone. His gaze traveled from their faces to the exposed cellar entrance to the disturbed floorboard and scattered personal effects. According to Wilcox, Thorne's expression did not change. There was no anger, no concern, merely a slight adjustment in his calculation. "I see you've been making yourselves at home," Thorne reportedly said, his voice as calm as if commenting on the weather. "Found my collection, did you?" Every man needs his hobbies in a place this remote. Walter Caldwell was conspicuously absent. When Williams demanded to know his whereabouts, Thorne shrugged with casual indifference. "He decided to wait at the line cabin with the others," he said. "Or perhaps I should say, he joined the others in a more permanent arrangement. As you will, too, now that necessity has forced my hand somewhat earlier than I'd planned." What followed was described by Wilcox as a conversation between predator and prey, where the predator still believed he held all advantages. Thorne made no attempt to deny what they had discovered, but seemed to regard their horror as a curiosity, an overreaction to what he apparently considered a natural order. He spoke with clinical detachment about his arrangements with isolated travelers over the years, how he had perfected his methods of selection and separation. "You wouldn't believe how many pass through these mountains," Thorne told them, "with no one keeping precise count. Nature claims many. I simply help myself to a few." Thorne went on to explain with disturbing pride how he had discovered that travelers were most vulnerable not on the main trails, where their disappearance might be noted, but when they had already deviated from established routes, whether due to weather, as in the case of Wilcox's party, or through deliberate misdirection. "The storm was fortunate," he said, "but not necessary. I have other methods of drawing suitable travelers to my door when the weather proves uncooperative. A light in the darkness rarely fails to attract those who fear being lost." Reynolds, apparently overcome with revulsion or fear, made a sudden move toward the door. Thorne's reaction was swift and practiced. A hunting knife produced from his belt found its mark in Reynolds's chest. The man collapsed, gasping, as Thorne turned his attention to Wilcox and Williams. What happened next is recounted with remarkable clarity in Wilcox's journal. Williams, a former soldier who had fought in the Civil War, had positioned himself behind Thorne during the confrontation. As Thorne advanced on Wilcox, Williams seized a heavy iron poker from beside the hearth and brought it down on the back of Thorne's skull with a sound like an axe embedding in wet wood. The blow did not kill Thorne immediately, but it incapacitated him long enough for Williams and Wilcox to bind him securely with leather straps found hanging in the cellar. Reynolds was beyond help, his life ebbing quickly. His last words, according to Wilcox, were a request that they make certain of Thorne, that the world be rid of him completely. The two survivors faced a grim calculation. They could not safely transport Reynolds' body or the wounded but still dangerous Thorne through the mountain terrain. Leaving Thorne alive and restrained was not an option they considered viable, given the mounting evidence of his long-standing predation on travelers. The isolation that had served his purposes would now serve justice, however rough. Wilcox's account of their solution is dispassionate, noting only that they ensured Thorne would claim no more victims, and that they committed the results to the same cellar that had witnessed his own depredations. He does not specify their exact actions, but the implication is clear enough for those who can read between the lines. Before departing, they conducted a more thorough search of the cabin, hoping to find some trace of the missing members of their party. While they discovered no living survivors, they gathered what evidence they could carry: the ledger containing Thorne's records, several identifiable personal effects from presumed victims, and a crude map found among Thorne's papers that marked the location of the cabin and several other sites in the surrounding mountains with small X's. Wilcox and Williams departed, leaving Reynolds' body covered respectfully near the trail where they hoped it might later be recovered. Using the main trail that they were able to locate with Williams' woodcraft, they made their way toward Taos. The journey was arduous, but uneventful, taking slightly over 2 days due to the lingering snow and their own exhausted condition. Upon arrival in Taos, on April 17th, they presented their evidence to local authorities, specifically to Territorial Marshal James Conklin, who maintained an office there. Initial skepticism gave way to concern as the ledger was examined, and the significance of the items they had recovered became apparent. Here, Wilcox's journal entries regarding the Thorne incident end, with a final note: "I have provided Marshal Conklin with a full account of our ordeal, as well as the location of the cabin as best Williams and I could determine it on his maps. He has promised a thorough investigation, though he cautions that the territorial government's resources are limited and that verification of Thorne's demise and recovery of any remains will take time to arrange. I find myself both eager for confirmation that the nightmare has truly ended and reluctant to contemplate returning to that place, even in the company of lawmen. Some shadows are best left undisturbed, though justice demands we cast light into them, regardless of our personal comfort. Territorial records indicate that an expedition was indeed dispatched to locate Thorne's cabin based on the directions provided by Wilcox and Williams. This party, led by Deputy Marshal Thomas Hargrove and comprising 4 armed men, departed Taos on April 23, 1868. They returned on April 29th, their findings largely corroborating the account provided by the survivors. The official report, filed by Deputy Hargrove and preserved in territorial records, states, "We located the cabin at approximately the position indicated. The structure had been partially burned. Whether by accident or design is unclear." The remains of an adult male, identified by documents as one Aaron Reynolds, were recovered from a position approximately 1/2 mile from the site, and have been returned to Taos for proper burial. The cellar beneath the cabin remained largely intact despite the fire above. Its contents necessitate further investigation by properly constituted authorities, as evidence suggests numerous travelers met with foul play at this location over an extended period. The Santa Fe Gazette of May 17, 1868, carried a brief article regarding the discovery, noting only that authorities are investigating disturbing findings at a remote cabin site in the Sangre de Cristo Range. Evidence suggests numerous travelers met with foul play at the hands of a solitary mountain dweller over the course of several years. Territorial Marshal Conklin assures the public that the individual responsible poses no further threat, having apparently met with fatal injury prior to the authorities' arrival. A more thorough investigation was launched in June, with Marshal Conklin personally leading a larger expedition to the site. This group included a physician from Santa Fe and several men with experience in tracking and wilderness survival. Their objective was to locate any additional sites marked on the map recovered from Thorne's cabin and to collect evidence that might help identify victims. The most complete record of this phase comes from the Territorial Marshal's official report, which was not made public at the time but was archived in Santa Fe. It documented the identification of at least 17 individuals who had likely fallen victim to Thorne over a period of approximately 5 years, based on personal effects recovered and entries in the ledger. The report noted that, given the transient nature of much of the territory's population and the hazards of mountain travel, a complete accounting may never be possible. The expedition located 3 additional sites marked on Thorne's map. 2 proved to be small line cabins, similar to the one described to Walter Caldwell, though no trace of Caldwell, his brother, Fletcher, or Hollister was found at either location. The 3rd site, marked with a different symbol than the others, led investigators to a remote canyon where they discovered what appeared to be a makeshift charnel pit, containing numerous human remains in various states of decomposition. Of particular interest was a passage in the Marshal's conclusions suggesting that Thorne's activities may have extended beyond simple murder. Several witnesses from settlements near the mountains reported purchasing smoked meat from a peddler, matching Thorne's description in the winters of 1866 and 1867. The Marshal's speculation regarding the true nature of this meat was relegated to a sealed addendum, with a note that such matters are better left unconfirmed in official records, lest they inspire unwholesome fascination or cast a pall over legitimate commerce in the region. The investigation also attempted to verify Thorne's claimed origins in Pennsylvania. No record of an Ezekiel Thorne from that state could be located in any census or church register from the period. However, a territorial official noted similarities between the description of Thorne and one Elijah Thornton, who had been sought for questioning in connection with several disappearances near Denver in 1862. Thornton had vanished before authorities could apprehend him, and no confirmed sighting had been reported since. By August of 1868, the Thorne investigation was officially concluded. Remains that could be identified were returned to families or given proper burial in the territorial cemetery. Personal effects lacking clear ownership were cataloged and stored in the Territorial Marshal's office, with notices placed in newspapers as far east as St. Louis inviting inquiries from those who might have lost contact with travelers in the New Mexico Territory between 1863 and 1868. Thomas Wilcox never fully recovered from his ordeal. His journal entries following the Thorne incident became increasingly fragmented and paranoid. He abandoned his position with the St. Louis Dispatch, informing his editors that he could no longer, in good conscience, provide accounts that might encourage further settlement in regions where civilization remains a veneer thinner than paper over unfathomable darkness. He relocated to Denver in early 1869, where he died under unclear circumstances several months later. The coroner's report listed the cause as nervous exhaustion leading to heart failure, a common diagnosis for deaths that defied simple explanation or that families preferred to keep private. James Williams, the former soldier who struck the blow that incapacitated Thorne, fared somewhat better. Territorial records indicate he provided formal testimony during the investigation, but declined to settle in the region afterward. A letter from Williams to Marshal Conklin, dated 1871, and preserved in the Territorial Archives, mentioned his relocation to California, where he hoped the sound of the ocean might finally drown out certain memories of the mountains. The letter continued with a passage that historians of the region have occasionally cited when discussing the psychological impact of frontier violence. I do not regret our actions regarding Thorne. Justice, rough though it was, found him in that remote place where law could not readily reach. What haunts me is not what we did, but how easily his mask of hospitality deceived us initially. I find myself studying the faces of those I meet, wondering what might lurk beneath their expressions of ordinary humanity. The frontier strips away many of civilization's constraints. Some men, I fear, merely await such an opportunity to reveal their true nature. The case of Ezekiel Thorne faded gradually from public consciousness, overshadowed by the territory's many other challenges and tragedies. By the time New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, it had become little more than a footnote in regional history, the kind of tale shared around campfires to unsettle listeners before being dismissed as exaggeration. Yet certain facts remain irrefutable. Between 1863 and 1868, an unusual number of travelers were recorded as having departed Santa Fe for points north, but never arrived at their destinations. The remains recovered from Thorne's property, while never publicly enumerated, required multiple burial plots in the territorial cemetery. And in the decades that followed, travelers in the Sangre de Cristo range reported an unusual reluctance among local guides to follow certain trails after dark, particularly those leading to isolated clearings that might once have held cabins. Perhaps most telling is an entry in the personal diary of Marshal James Conklin, who led the investigation. Dated December 18, 1868, it reads simply, "Close the Thorne matter today, officially. Yet I find myself unable to pass meat stalls in the market without wondering. The mountains keep their secrets well, but not well enough to let a man sleep easy after what we found." The cabin site itself was deliberately obscured following the investigation. Maps from the period show the trail rerouted to avoid the clearing entirely. When the Sangre de Cristo Range was formally surveyed in the 1880s, the location was marked with a simple notation, unsuitable for development. No further explanation was provided. In 1963, during construction of what would eventually become the Enchanted Circle Scenic Byway, workers uncovered what appeared to be the stone foundation of a substantial structure near Carson National Forest. Work was temporarily halted while archaeologists examined the site. Their findings were documented in a brief report that noted evidence of fire damage and what might have been a subterranean chamber. Shortly thereafter, the planned route was adjusted by several hundred yards due to unstable soil conditions. The artifacts recovered were cataloged and stored at the University of New Mexico, but were reportedly lost during a facility reorganization in 1967. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, who participated in the 1963 excavation as a graduate student, published a paper in the Journal of Southwestern Archaeology in 1968 titled Material Evidence of Isolated Frontier Violence, a Case Study from Northern New Mexico. Without explicitly connecting the site to the historical Thorne case, Vasquez documented several unusual findings, including a stone foundation that had been deliberately filled with rocks and soil after the structure above had burned, as though to ensure nothing could emerge from below. Most intriguing was Vasquez's documentation of unusual markings found on several of the foundation stones, crude symbols that she suggested might have had ritual significance to the inhabitant. These symbols, reproduced in her paper, bear striking resemblance to markings recorded in Marshal Conklin's inventory of items found in Thorne's ledger. Vasquez's academic career was cut short when she accepted a position with the Bureau of Land Management in 1969, and she published no further research on the site. And so the full truth of Ezekiel Thorne and his mountain hospitality remains somewhat obscured, preserved primarily in fragmented records and the fading memory of a territory that has since transformed into a state with different concerns and legends. Yet for those who study the history of the region's darker chapters, certain patterns emerge that suggest Thorne may not have been entirely unique, merely the one who was discovered. The mountains of New Mexico have witnessed countless journeys, countless lives passing through their unforgiving terrain. Most travelers find their way safely to their destinations. Some fall victim to the natural hazards of altitude, weather, and isolation. And perhaps a few, over the centuries, have encountered hosts whose hospitality concealed motives that civilized society prefers not to contemplate. In the words of James Williams's final communication with the territorial authorities before he disappeared into his new California life, "What troubles me most is not what Thorne did, nor even why he might have done it. It's how easily we accepted his explanations, how readily we dismissed our own unease. The true danger was not that he existed, but that he understood human nature well enough to move among us undetected for so long. I wonder how many others might be out there still, serving travelers something more than water, secure in the knowledge that we would rather believe comforting lies than confront unbearable truth." The Sangre de Cristo Range stands today much as it did in Thorne's time, beautiful, imposing, and indifferent to human concerns. Tourists and hikers traverse its trails, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The mountains, like the past, keep their secrets close. But occasionally, in certain remote clearings, long-time residents claim the soil remains curiously barren, as though the earth itself remembers what took place there and refuses to nurture new life. As for Thorne himself, his origins before appearing in the New Mexico territory remain unknown. The man who offered shelter and sustenance to weary travelers appears to have emerged from nowhere, and in the end left nothing behind but questions and unmarked graves. Some secrets are perhaps better left buried in the high mountain soil, their details lost to time and deliberate obscurity. But the lesson remains relevant even today. Hospitality offered in the wilderness may come with a price not measured in coin, and some shelters, no matter how welcoming they appear to the cold and weary traveler, are best left unentered. For those who travel the scenic byways of northern New Mexico today, passing through the same mountain ranges that Wilcox and his companions traversed, the views are spectacular, the air clear and bracing. Modern roads have tamed much of the terrain's danger. Yet local historians note that certain areas remain strangely undeveloped, passed over by progress for reasons no contemporary planner can quite articulate. In these places, where the forest grows thick and shadows gather early in the mountain afternoons, perhaps something of Ezekiel Thorne's legacy lingers, not as a presence, but as an absence, a void in the landscape that nature and humanity alike instinctively avoid. The next time you find yourself on a mountain road as dusk approaches, and see lights twinkling invitingly through the trees, promising rest and comfort, perhaps you'll recall this account. Most such lights lead to genuine safety, to the hospitality of good people. But perhaps, as you accept their welcome, you might take a moment to study your host's eyes, to note how they watch you, to question whether the interest they show is entirely benevolent. After all, in the words of Thomas Wilcox's final journal entry, written shortly before his death in Denver, "Civilization is but a thin veneer laid over older appetites. In the wilderness, where eyes are few and witnesses fewer, that veneer sometimes slips. I have seen what lies beneath and now can never unsee it. I look into the faces of those around me, the banker, the shopkeeper, the physician, and wonder, if circumstances were different, if accountability were removed, what hungers might they too indulge? We are not so far removed from the wilderness as we pretend." The case of the mountain man who served more than water remains officially closed. The territorial records were sealed, the physical evidence lost or destroyed, the location deliberately obscured. But the account persists, passed down through generations of local historians and archivists, a reminder of the territory's unvarnished past and the dangers that once lurked in its remote places, dangers wearing human faces and offering human comforts to the unwary traveler. The mountains remain, the trails remain, and somewhere in the collective memory of the place, Ezekiel Thorne remains as well, not as a man, but as a caution. Be careful where you seek shelter, be mindful of what you consume, and always, always trust the unease that prickles at the back of your neck when a stranger's hospitality seems too readily offered in places where no one keeps count of those who pass through.